Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Project Octane. Sorry I'm a little late getting this episode out. It's been a busy week. I spent far too much time watching GameStop. Damn it. GameStop stock. GameStop stock. Haven't done a whole lot of editing or recording. But with hope, like the rest of you Diamond Hand boys, I'll be able to finance this whole project with what's going on right now. But with this project, we should probably talk about that. Where we're at right now is very much just in the brainstorming ideas. And so there's a lot of things where I'm going down a million different paths, considering a whole bunch of different options, and then realizing at some point that it is going to work or it isn't going to work, and then bouncing off to another separate idea and pursuing that. And so what you end up with is, or at least what I've ended up with in all the other recordings I've done this week, is very iterative, very jumping back and forth, lots of repeating things, kind of how you mentally think when you're considering a whole bunch of different options. And so for that reason, rather than just trimming down a stream like I did for the first episode, I'm sort of going to go back over and recover things here in this recording. So hopefully it's a lot more streamlined and a lot less annoying. But for today, I've already done a little bit of work. We're going to be talking about packaging the rest of the systems, not just the driver, before we proceed. And so the next big ticket item on our list is the engine, transmission, drivetrain. So you can see here, I came in, I put in some vertical lines just as references in the sketch. All these are is a bit of a buffer, headrest, and firewall offset for the forwardmost position of the engine, the wheel center, and the rear end. None of these dimensions are accurate, as you know. That's still working off of the model scale, not the actual scale. And so before we really go any further, I think it's important that we at least discuss, or I at least mention, kind of some of the options that are out there that we're going to consider. And the easiest way to do it is just to look at some schematics of existing vehicle systems. So this is the first image we're going to look at and just briefly go over the layout for a couple different drive systems. First off, you have your front wheel drive, where your engine, you can see here the gray, is mounted what we call transversely. You have transverses laterally across the vehicle, and then longitudinally would be with the length of the vehicle. And so in a front wheel drive car, you have a very compact engine bay where your engine is mounted transversely, coupled up to your transmission, and then normally this is referred to as a transaxle, because your front differential, which splits power to the front wheels, is included in the same housing, is geared directly off the transmission. From there, power is distributed outwards. This is a super common setup, and what you'll probably see, I imagine if we looked up the top 10 selling vehicles in the US, not including trucks, that's the kind of setup you would see in probably all of them. Your next most common option is probably your rear wheel drive setup, and you're going to see that in any rear-wheel drive car, such as Mustangs, Camaros. I know Challengers. I don't know about Chargers. Most of your muscle cars are rear-wheel drive, where your engine is mounted longitudinally. Same with the transmission, butted up right up against the end of it, and then you have a long drive shaft to the rear differential that splits power. Very similar to this, you have a four-wheel drive, pretty much what you'll see in just about every pickup truck. Essentially the same thing, except with your transmission here, you have a transfer case that's going to divert power to a front differential as well, and that's what's going to give you your four-wheel drive. Difference between that and all-wheel drive is that four-wheel drive is usually not all the time. It is on a selective basis. So before we talk about all-wheel drive, let's at least talk about how these three options look in our system. Right off the bat, the easiest thing to talk about is the rear-wheel drive and four-wheel drive setup. Here, even if you get rid of this long drive shaft in between the transmission and the rear differential. This system overall is significantly longer, and so I can tell you right off the bat that we're not actually going to be able to fit that in our Octane. And so when you put that engine in, a transmission, and then a differential, getting the power back up to where these rear wheels are is just not going to be feasible. Same deal goes for the four-wheel drive, but one thing you might ask yourself is, well, what if you cut off the rear axle here and only used front-wheel drive? And that's actually something we're going to look at in just a minute when we talk about some of the all-wheel drive concepts. In a regular four-wheel drive setup, though, that's not something you're going to look at, and that's because your primary mode of power transfer is still through the rear axle. Most of these are not in a situation where you can isolate power to the front only. So that kind of takes these two out of the picture. But to talk about the front wheel drive for a moment, things get pretty interesting. Ideally, being able to put this transaxle setup into our Octane would be great. I mean, that would save us a lot of space. It's a very compact system, and it's super popular, like we said. So it's going to be something where you can find a lot of donor vehicles readily available. It's going to be very cheap. There's going to be lots of opportunities and parts, and easy to service, all of that. The problem is that although our Octane has the track width of a regular car, the engine bay and the body is significantly thinner across the sides than in most vehicles. And so one of the dimensions we took in episode 1, I believe, was roughly 26 inches across the outside of the two highlighted parts on the Octane here. If we were to be a little bit more generous and look at some of these sort of tubing piping for probably the exhaust here or whatever's going on for your boost, even if we go to the outside of those, we're still only looking at about 32 inches. And in pretty much every option I looked at, this engine and transaxle setup is going to be wider than 32 inches. We're not going to be able to fit it in here. That being said, if you kind of follow me down the crazy hole for a minute, because that's what this whole week's been, if you were to take this setup and imagine rotating it 90 degrees such that now your two drive shafts were pointed forwards and backwards, that system being only 40 inches or so long does fit easily behind our driver and in front of our rear axle here. The problem then becomes how you get the power back to the wheels, in which case you're going to have to then have a differential similar to one of these setups that takes that power that's now going the lengthwise of the car and divert it to the rear wheels. Essentially what we're saying here is taking this whole rear wheel drive system but putting in a engine transmission package that is a lot more compact, and then trying to divert power to the rear wheels from there. The problems that pop up with that setup is that in most front wheel drive vehicles, the front differential that's built in here is open. And what I mean by that is that power is given to the wheel with the less resistance. So if you imagine that one wheel is lifted off the ground, in most cases, rather than spinning and applying torque to the wheel that has traction, it's going to sit there and it's going to spin that wheel that's not touching the ground. And so the same theory applies if you turn this 90 degrees and you no longer have this front axle that's pointing forwards connected to anything, it's just cut off. It's going to sit there and spin freely, and you're not going to get any power transfer to the rear. So what we'd essentially have to do is break that diff open, weld it such that it acts like a closed diff, and it is going to transfer power to both axles, one that's not connected to anything, and then one that goes back to our rear differential setup. And then in addition to that, the other issue is that you already have a gear reduction that's called your final drive ratio from that front differential to these axles. And so if you then take that axle and align it with another differential, you have a second final drive reduction. And in our case, what that would do is make a very torquey setup. You're going to see high revs at low speed and an overall much lower top speed. And top speed isn't necessarily something we're going with, but it's going to make an almost impossible driving experience when you have those two final drive reductions. So the only way to get around that is to then somehow have a gear multiplier rather than a reduction or an amplifier in between where that transaxle output is and where your differential is. While that's all very doable, you can kind of follow me that this idea keeps going further and further down the rabbit hole of, well, I could do this, except I have to rotate it 90 degrees, except I then have to weld the diff and add another diff and then put a planetary gearbox in between to undiff the front diff, and it's just more and more ridiculous. But it is feasible. So at least compared to our other two options so far, it looks like a winner. But before we get carried away with that, I think it's important to talk about all-wheel drive setups. For that, I'm going to bring up another image. This is what most of your modern all-wheel drive setups look like. And if you say, hey, that looks like a front-wheel drive transaxle with just another transfer case in here to divert power to a rear axle, then you would be correct, because that's exactly what it is. And in this setup, it does absolutely nothing for us. Again, it just now gives us another axle that is transmitting power that we can't use, because we already can't mount this transversely because of the width across here. So we already talked about turning that, and having another axle that's now pointing in a different direction, that's not in the direction of power delivery, is just not useful. That being said, this is not the only all-wheel drive setup out there. It is the most common that you will see in most compact SUVs, but Subaru would like to have a word with you, because in their all-wheel drive setup, they're essentially looking more like our four-wheel drive layout here. They do have a longitudinally mounted boxer engine coupled with the transmission and a drive shaft to a rear differential. The only difference here is that the transfer case and front axle to your front diff is all built into the same transmission housing, and that way they're able to keep things much more compact. So to bring up another image on screen, as if there weren't enough, you can see how I was just talking about how that front differential and how power is transferred is all much more compact than just the size and scale that this looks like. And that gives us a little bit of hope. The length of this transmission as a whole is not a whole lot. I actually have a friend who's got a Subaru Outback that has that longitudinal boxer engine coupled to a transmission just like this. And so I actually had his car, I was under his car the other day with a tape measure, taking measurements from the rear output shaft up to where the front diff is, up to where the front of the engine was, width and all of that. And I'll show you a couple of those dimensions here in a moment. This is also very similar to what you see in some mid-engine vehicles. Now, a mid-engine vehicle, if anyone doesn't know, rather than your engine being in the front of the vehicle, it's behind the driver. And in the case of a Porsche 911 or 718 or most of their mid-engine vehicles, you're essentially taking this Subaru setup without a rear output shaft and just mounting it back by the rear wheels. And this is sort of the ideal case, because rather than having in the Subaru option here, we'd still have to disconnect this rear wheel drive aspect of the all-wheel drive system and only run off of front wheel drive. With the Porsche setup, it's already geared to be that rear wheel drive setup with everything mounted longitudinally that we're talking about. So why didn't I just start with that and say that's what we're going to do? Well, the problem is Porsches are expensive, and I ain't got the money right now to invest in a 911 to tear it apart and use it for parts. I did end up looking up the Porsche Boxster because that is a much more affordable vehicle, but even then you're talking about $10,000 for a 2003 model that has 120,000 miles on it. I think that's a little bit too much. So we'll leave that on the table for now as, you know, probably the most feasible option mechanically, but probably the less financially reasonable option. Whereas if we can make this Subaru transmission work, then we can find these abundantly. So like I said, I ran up to a buddy's house and I took a whole bunch of measurements, and this is essentially what we have. From the front of the engine to the rear of the transmission, I believe that number corresponded to 54 inches. The dimension from the rear of the transmission to the wheel center was this dimension, which came out to roughly 34 inches. Now, in that layout, the wheel center is not necessarily where the actual output, that front engine output shaft is. The CV axles are angled slightly in order to work with the front suspension, and so the actual output shaft position was roughly 4 inches behind this. It wasn't here, it was roughly about here. So the question came up, well, if they can angle it 4 inches up, well, can't I angle it 4 inches back? And that's essentially what this number is. It's actually another 2 inches past that, so it's 6 inches back rather than 4 inches back. And that distance back doesn't matter so much as the angle of the CV axle. It's just easier to talk about and look at in this side view and use that distance. But even with the axles angled rearward like so, it still puts us in a situation where we're almost, I believe it came out somewhere between 6 and 8 inches sticking out the back end of our Octane. And so, while it's not going to be nearly this large because the transmission thankfully does get smaller towards the end, we'd still end up with about a 3-inch tube that sticks out 8 inches here. And to me, that's wasn't really something that I think we could consider. That being said, the part of the transmission that sticks out is that aspect of the rear-wheel drive, that center differential that they'll refer to in the transmission. And depending on the Subaru transmission you get, mostly, I believe the options available for the manuals, you can actually put in a lockout tool and disconnect the rear housing of this transmission, block it off, and run it as a front-wheel drive only without that extension. And so that makes it incredibly close to what our packaging requirements are. I think it would probably barely squeeze in. If anything, we could always take this box and bring it out just a bit behind the boost exhaust, I'll call it. And that is an option, but it's not without its simplicity. Again, similar to the front wheel drive setup, we're talking about making modifications that are not going to be easy and are going to make things a little bit more difficult with this. But nevertheless, that is the setup that is most comparable to our Porsche mid-engine layout that we said it was most mechanically makes sense, but less financially. This provides us a not quite as mechanically sound option, but a significantly more financially sound option to look at. And if you go on Copart or other sites where you're just looking at a scrap Subaru, in our case, we can get something, and we can get it a lot more reasonable than we can get the Porsche. So in terms of options that I would pursue, I think that would put this option in front of the Porsche, and still with our modified Frankenstein front wheel drive setup last of the three. So that's all settled, right? We just buy a Subaru, muck up the transmission, and build a car, right? Well, again, we are in this phase of concept generation where it's important to consider all possibilities. And as such, I think it's important that we look at an option that, in my opinion, isn't as popular, but for our scale and for our packaging requirements, very well could be the best option, and that's to look at a bike engine. This is a Honda CBR 600 engine. 600cc is 0.6 of a liter compared to, say, the Subaru setup where you're looking at a 2.4 or 2.5. Even with most of your front wheel drive options, you're looking somewhere at a 1.6 to 2.0, that sort of range size engine for what we're looking at. So this is significantly smaller. But the beauty of it is, if we're limited by that 26 width dimension, this engine can fit into our system in any configuration that we choose. Significantly less power, but if we do have a vehicle weight overall that is significantly lighter than a normal vehicle, then that power to weight ratio is going to balance out somewhat, and we can still have something that's fun to drive. So why a CBR 600? Well, one of my best friends from college that I continue to stay in touch with just so happens to be in possession of an old Formula CE car, a CBR 600 with a turbo on it. And what's nice about these engines is that because they're built for motorcycles, they're already very compact. The transmission is not nearly as large. It's integrated into the engine housing. And what that means is our output shaft from that transmission, we can either connect to a rear differential via a chain drive if the engine were to be mounted transversely. We can run a chain back to the rear axle, or because we have the space available lengthwise here, because if you're working with a much smaller package, you could mount it longitudinally and run a drive shaft from the output of the transmission back to a more standard style rear differential from a car. So this wasn't a case that I was originally looking that hard into. I was very much going down the road of what car options can we make sense, because bikes aren't cheap. You can buy a Subaru with the engine package that we were talking about for less. But in this case, where we can have a bike engine at a good cost and a package that we can test and run, I think that this really gives us the most flexibility. And what I mean by that too was that even if we looked at the Subaru option, where the rearward facing CV axles coming back, this is going to create a whole bunch of suspension issues as well when you look at actually getting power from the body out. And that's something I'm going to talk more about in the next episode. But essentially, to give you a brief idea of what we're looking at in the next episode, if we're also trying to use a sort of stock suspension setup off of a vehicle in order to reduce cost and have less engineering design time in this project, the way your suspension setup and everything is packaged and the size and the dimensions that we're talking about using for things creates a set of limited options, and taking two things that aren't compatible and trying to force them to be compatible further constrains those requirements. And so being able to do something where you might not have nearly as much power, but could be more than enough for our application, is going to be a lot easier to package and work around all those requirements. So that's what I'm leaning towards right now. I'm going to dig around and try and get some models so we can actually visualize how that solution works. But before we do that, I encourage you to watch part 2 of this packaging and layout session. I think I'm going to call it episode 3, where we're going to look at the other end of the spectrum before we sort of make any final decisions. So I know that wasn't a whole lot. We really didn't do anything in CAD. It's difficult still at the point where we're visualizing a lot of things and chasing opportunities. But hopefully we'll get to a point where we can start putting models together and start breaking things down in the very near future. So if you have any thoughts or suggestions, please feel free to let me know. And thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.